They called him Samuel the slave, but that was only the name written in ledgers, scratched in ink by men who believed ownership could be proven with paper. Among the cabins, among the whispers that slipped through cracks in wooden walls at night, he was known by other names, names spoken softly, as if the darkness itself might overhear and report them. Some called him the one who walks back. Others said simply, the dangerous one. But on that particular night in Alabama, when the air was thick with storm and the sky pressed low like a lid about to snap shut, Samuel stood alone inside a narrow room and felt something far more powerful than danger stirring in his chest. He felt certainty. The room smelled of old wood, sweat, and iron. Chains lay coiled near the wall, their links dull and scarred, each mark a memory of struggle. Outside, thunder rolled slowly, not loud yet, but deep, like a warning carried from miles away. Rain had not started, but the wind pushed through the trees with restless fingers, making the leaves hiss and shiver. Samuel listened to that sound and smiled, just barely, because the night was speaking a language he understood. He was tall, though years of labor had bent his shoulders slightly forward, as if the earth itself were always pulling him down. His hands were rough, split at the knuckles, darkened by sun and soil. Scars crossed his arms and back in quiet patterns, each one earned, none forgotten. But his eyes, those unsettled men who looked into them, held something they could never name. Not anger exactly, not fear. It was a calm that felt planned, deliberate, as if every breath Samuel took had already been considered and approved by his own soul. He moved toward the small window, the one with bars set deep into the frame. Rain finally began to fall, light at first, tapping gently like cautious footsteps. Samuel placed his fingers against the wood and felt the vibration of thunder pass through the walls. 13 times, he thought, not with pride, not with regret, but with the clear accounting of a man who knows his own history too well to romanticize it. 13 times he had slipped away from this place or places like it. 13 times he had felt the brief, sharp sweetness of distance growing behind him. And yet here he was again, breathing the same air, hearing the same chains whisper his name. People assumed escape was a single moment, a break, a sprint, a leap into freedom. Samuel knew better. Escape was a conversation between patience and courage, between the body and the land. It began long before feet moved. It began in watching guards change shifts, in counting heartbeats between lantern swings, in learning how mud swallowed sound and how water erased scent. It began in listening, and Samuel had been listening his entire life. He turned from the window and crossed the room quietly. Every step was measured. The floor creaked in places, but he knew exactly where to place his weight to keep it silent. Knowledge hadn't come from luck. It had come from nights spent awake, memorizing the language of wood and nail. Outside, the storm grew bolder. Rain drummed harder now, washing the world clean of edges, blurring the plantation into shadows and movement. Perfect, Samuel thought. Nights like this hid sins and saved men. As he reached for the chain, his fingers brushed the cold metal, and a memory flashed, hands forcing iron around his wrists, laughter in the background, a voice saying, "This one thinks too much." Samuel almost laughed at that. Thinking was the only thing they had never been able to stop him from doing. They could bruise his body, starve him, work him until his muscles screamed, but his thoughts had always slipped through their fingers like smoke. He eased the chain aside, slow enough that it barely whispered. His breathing remained steady. Fear tried to rise as it always did, but he greeted it like an old acquaintance and pushed it gently away. Fear had its uses, panic did not. He had learned that lesson early, learned it the first time he ran, and the dogs came so close he could hear their breath. Fear sharpened him. Panic would have killed him. Thunder cracked suddenly, loud and close, rattling the walls. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied. Samuel paused, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. No footsteps followed. The storm had swallowed the sound. He moved again. As he prepared himself, Samuel's mind drifted, not to freedom as others imagined it, but to motion, to movement, to the simple fact of choosing where his next step would fall. That choice, more than any distant dream, was what pulled him forward. Freedom was too large to hold all at once. Movement was something he could claim, one step at a time. He thought of the first time he had realized this truth. He had been younger then, smaller, his back unmarked by the worst years. He had watched an older man collapse in the field, watched the overseer curse and kick dust at him as if he were already dead. That night, Samuel had lain awake and understood something with terrifying clarity. Staying was its own kind of death. Running, even if it ended in capture, at least meant choosing how to face that end. The rain soaked deeper now, and water began to drip through the roof in slow, steady drops. Samuel welcomed it. Rain softened the ground, blurred tracks, confused dogs. Rain was an ally, indifferent but reliable. He tightened the cloth around his waist, checked the small bundle he had hidden earlier, a scrap of cornbread, a piece of cloth torn into strips, nothing more. He had learned long ago not to burden himself with things. The land provided what it could. Excess only slowed a man down. For a moment he stood perfectly still, eyes closed, listening. The plantation breathed around him, the distant murmur of voices, the low creak of a barn door, the steady percussion of rain on leaves. In that stillness, Samuel felt the familiar mixture of sorrow and resolve. He was running because he believed this would be the last time. He was running because not running would be a lie. He opened his eyes and smiled again, a little wider this time. Somewhere, perhaps miles away, the world existed beyond fences and patrols, beyond whips and names written in books. He did not need to see it yet. It was enough to know it was there. As Samuel slipped toward the door, the thunder rolled once more, louder than before, as if the sky itself were urging him on. The chains behind him lay quiet now, harmless for the moment. Outside waited darkness, rain, danger, and choice. Samuel reached for the latch, his heart steady, his mind clear. They would wake soon. They always did. They would shout his name, curse his absence, send men and dogs to hunt him through the wet fields and woods. They would call him foolish, reckless, dangerous. They would say he always came back, as if that were proof of failure. But standing there on the edge of the night, Samuel knew the truth they never would. He did not escape because he thought he could disappear forever. He escaped because each time he left, he proved to himself that no chain was final, no wall absolute, no claim complete. And as the door eased open and the storm swallowed him whole, Samuel stepped into the darkness already planning his escape, not just from the plantation, but from the lie that he had ever truly belonged to anyone else. Samuel belonged to the fields long before the fields learned his name, long before his back knew the exact rhythm of the overseer's steps, or his hands learned how cotton cut skin. As cleanly as a blade, the land had already begun to study him. The soil remembered the weight of his feet. The trees knew the sound of his breathing. Even the river, slow and brown, had carried his reflection often enough to recognize him when he knelt at its edge. Men thought they owned him, but the land understood something different. Samuel was listening. Each morning began the same way. A bell or a shouted command shattered sleep, and bodies rose from dirt floors like ghosts called back too soon. Samuel stood with the others, shoulders bare to the dawn chill, eyes lowered, face calm. He did not rush, he did not lag. He had learned that being noticed was as dangerous as being slow. The men who survived longest were the ones who moved like shadows, present, useful, forgettable. Samuel made himself useful. Forgettable was harder. The work broke weaker men. Long rows of cotton stretched endlessly under a sun that seemed to burn not just skin but thought itself. Hours passed, measured only by pain and thirst. Samuel worked with steady precision, his hands quick but controlled. He wasted no motion. Every pull, every step, Every breath was counted. It wasn't efficiency that unsettled the overseers, it was his eyes. They were never empty. Even when his head bowed, his gaze flickered, always reading, always measuring. He learned patterns the way other men learned prayers. The overseer favored his left leg when tired. The dogs were fed later on Sundays. The north fence post leaned slightly inward, its base softened by years of rain. At night, when others collapsed into exhausted sleep, Samuel lay awake, staring into darkness, replaying the day in his mind like a map. Mistakes were dangerous. Memory was survival. Pain visited him often. Whips did not discriminate between intention and accident. A missed quota, a moment's pause too long, a look interpreted as defiance, any could earn blood. Samuel endured it without sound. Not because he felt nothing, but because he understood something vital. Screams pleased the wrong people. Silence denied them that pleasure. Silence, too, gave him time. Time to remember every face, every voice, every weakness. The others noticed him, though they rarely spoke of it openly. In low murmurs after dark, when the air was thick with breath and fear, they whispered about Samuel's calm, about the way he seemed untouched inside, even when his back was torn. Some said he was reckless, that thinking too much only led to trouble. Others watched him closely, memorizing his movements as if they were lessons. Samuel never called himself brave. He called himself prepared. It was during his second year on that particular plantation that the reputation began to grow. Not loudly at first, just questions. How had he survived the last escape? How had he crossed the swamp without being swallowed by it? Why had the dogs lost his trail so quickly? Samuel answered none of it. He knew better than to turn truth into stories. Stories traveled. Stories reached the wrong ears. Instead, he showed things quietly. He shifted his step so it landed on roots instead of leaves. He waited for wind before moving through brush. He taught others how to watch the stars without staring too long. Not freedom lessons, survival lessons. He never said run, he said notice. That was why his masters feared him more than the loud ones. Loud defiance could be crushed. Quiet understanding spread. Samuel understood fear intimately. He felt it crawl under his skin each time he saw a body hanging too long in the sun, each time a friend disappeared and never returned. Fear was always there, coiled tight, ready to strike, but he had learned to live alongside it, not beneath it. Fear sharpened his senses. It reminded him of what was at stake. At night, when the air cooled and insects sang, Samuel sometimes let his thoughts wander to things he barely remembered. A mother's voice, the weight of a hand steadying him when he was small. Those memories were blurred, frayed by time and suffering, but they anchored him. He was not born to be owned. He held on to that truth like a stone in his pocket, something solid he could touch when everything else felt unreal. The overseers tried different tactics with him. They gave him heavier loads, hoping exhaustion would dull his mind. They placed him under closer watch, assigning guards who prided themselves on vigilance. None of it worked. Samuel adjusted. He always adjusted. Pressure, he had learned, revealed weak points on both sides. One afternoon, under a sun so harsh it seemed to bleach color from the world, an overseer leaned close and whispered, "You think you're smarter than us." Samuel did not respond. He kept his eyes on the ground. Inside, he corrected the man silently. Smarter wasn't the word, patient was. It was patience that allowed Samuel to observe how men grew careless. Guards grew bored, dogs tired, authority rotted from routine. The plantation relied on repetition to function. Samuel relied on it to break free. His second escape from that place came without drama. No shouting, no sudden sprint, just absence. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. By the time the alarm sounded, rain had already begun to fall, softening tracks, blurring certainty. He moved through the woods like something born to them, his feet finding the ground without sound. He did not look back. That escape lasted longer than the first. long enough for hope to begin forming dangerous shapes in his mind, long enough to taste something like peace as he slept under open sky, free of commands, long enough to imagine not returning. And yet, when they caught him, when iron closed around his wrists once more, Samuel felt no surprise, only a grim understanding. The world beyond the plantation was vast, but it was not yet ready for him. Not yet. They dragged him back, bloodied and thin. The guards laughed, called him foolish, asked why he bothered. Samuel did not answer. His silence was heavier than words. He walked back through the gates on his own feet, head high, eyes clear. That walk unsettled them more than the escape itself, because Samuel did not return broken. He returned learning. Each escape taught him something new, not just about the land, but about people. About how fear made men cruel, how power made them lazy, how hope frightened them most of all. He began to understand that his escapes were not failures simply because he was brought back. They were rehearsals. Each one stretched the boundaries of what was possible, not just for him, but for those watching. In the cabins at night, his name carried a different weight now. Not admiration exactly, something quieter, something steadier. Samuel, the one who leaves. Samuel, the one who comes back. Samuel, the one who knows. He never told them he would free them. He never promised rescue or rebellion. He gave them something more dangerous, belief. Belief that chains were not natural. Belief that the land could be learned. Belief that even returning could be an act of defiance. And as seasons turned and his reputation grew, the masters wrote his name in their books with heavier ink. Next to it, they added notes. Watch closely, dangerous, likely to run again. They were right, because Samuel was not planning just another escape. He was planning endurance. He was becoming something they could not predict. A man whose greatest weapon was not speed or strength, but the quiet certainty that no matter how many times he was dragged back, his spirit would arrive intact, already searching for the next way out. The first escape was never supposed to last. Samuel understood that even as he made it. He had not fooled himself into believing that freedom lay just beyond the next tree line, waiting patiently like a reward. What he wanted, what he needed, was proof. Proof that his body could still answer his will. Proof that the world beyond the plantation gates was real and not a story told to keep men quiet. So when the night came, thin and cold, with clouds drifting low and the guards already tired of their own vigilance, Samuel moved not with hope, but with intention. He slipped away as if he had simply misplaced himself. There was no dramatic break, no burst of speed that tore breath from his lungs. He waited. He listened. He counted footsteps and heartbeats until the rhythm of the place settled into something predictable. Then he stepped out of it. One moment he was part of the plantation's order, another cog turning beneath the overseer's gaze. The next, he was nothing but a shadow sliding between fences. The ground beyond the fields felt different under his feet, less beaten down, less resigned. Grass bent instead of crunching. Dirt gave slightly, as if surprised by his weight. Samuel breathed deeper there, filling his chest with air that didn't taste of sweat and command. He moved steadily, not fast enough to panic, not slow enough to hesitate. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed clear. Fear whispered constantly, but he refused to answer it. He headed south first, not because it was right, but because it was wrong. Everyone ran north. Dogs were trained for that. Owly, already knowing. There was no panic, only a tight, bitter understanding. He ran anyway. Because he believed he could outrun them, but because surrendering before he had to felt like betrayal. Branches tore at his skin as he pushed through brush, thorns catching cloth and flesh alike. His lungs screamed. The ground betrayed him, roots snagging his feet, mud sucking at his steps. Behind him, the dogs closed the distance, their voices sharpening, turning his name into sound. Samuel did not look back. When they caught him, it was quick and brutal. Weight slammed into his legs, teeth snapped close enough for him to feel the heat of breath. Men followed soon after, shouting, cursing, triumphant. A blow landed against his head, bright and ringing. He fell, the world spinning, rain and dirt mixing on his face. They bound him tightly, ropes cutting into already raw skin. Someone laughed and asked why he had bothered. Samuel said nothing. His silence was not pride, it was preservation. Words would have given them something to break. The walk back to the plantation took hours. Each step burned. Blood dried and cracked against his skin. Guards prodded him when he slowed, eager to remind him who held power. Samuel focused on placing one foot in front of the other. He counted steps. He counted breaths. He did not count regret. When they dragged him through the gates, eyes followed. Other enslaved men and women paused in their work just long enough to see him, dirty, beaten, alive. Some looked away quickly, afraid of being noticed. Others stared, their faces tight with something like grief. Samuel met none of their eyes. He kept his head level, his back straight. That was when the guard leaned close and mocked him. "Why run if you're just going to come back?" The words were meant to wound, to shrink him. Samuel felt their weight, but he did not bend. He did not answer, because the truth was too large, too dangerous to give away. He returned not because he had failed, but because he had learned. They punished him publicly. Whips cut through air and skin alike. Pain flared bright and consuming, each strike a demand for submission. Samuel endured it with clenched teeth, his body arching despite his will. He did not scream. The crowd watched. The overseer watched closely, waiting for something to break. Nothing did. In the days that followed, Samuel healed slowly. Wounds scabbed, muscles stiffened, sleep came heavier now, weighted by exhaustion. Yet inside him, something had shifted. The world felt larger, the plantation felt smaller. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He knew now, with certainty rooted deep in bone, that escape was possible, not easy, not permanent, but possible. Others noticed the change. It was subtle, but it was there. Samuel moved differently. He watched more carefully. He spoke even less. At night, when whispers traveled from bed to bed, his name surfaced again, carried with a new tone. He was no longer just a man who thought too much. He was proof. One evening, as he sat outside his cabin, letting the last light fade, a younger man approached him quietly. "What was it like?" he asked, voice barely above breath. Samuel looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Quiet," he said finally. And that was all. The guard's question echoed in his mind sometimes. Why run if you're just going to come back? Samuel turned it over again and again, refining the answer he would never speak aloud. He ran because each escape carved a path inside him that could not be erased. He ran because returning on his own feet frightened them more than disappearing forever. He ran because coming back without surrender showed others that capture was not the same as defeat. The first escape taught him the cost. It taught him pain, hunger, exhaustion, and the limits of his body. But it also taught him something far more dangerous. It taught him that chains only worked if he believed in them, and Samuel never would again. So when his wounds healed and his strength returned, he began preparing without announcing it, watching, learning, waiting. Because the first escape was never meant to be the last, it was only the beginning. By the time Samuel escaped the second and third times, the plantation had begun to change its behavior around him, not in ways that could be written down or proven, but in small nervous adjustments that revealed fear beneath authority. Guards lingered longer near his cabin. Overseers pretended not to watch him while never truly looking away. Dogs were kept closer, fed better, praised more often, as if they alone stood between order and collapse. Samuel noticed all of it. He noticed because noticing had become his shield. The fourth escape was different. It was not born from impulse or desperation. It grew slowly, patiently, like a seed buried deep where no one thought to look. Samuel had learned from the first 3 attempts that speed alone meant nothing. Distance meant nothing. What mattered was timing, and timing was a language spoken by routine. The plantation lived on routine. Men trusted it. Samuel exploited it. Days passed. Weeks. Samuel worked without complaint, his body moving with mechanical obedience. He accepted extra tasks. He volunteered when others hesitated. The overseers began to relax, mistaking usefulness for submission. That was the oldest mistake men like them made. They believed obedience erased thought. They believed silence meant surrender. At night, Samuel listened, not just to guards and dogs, but to people. He listened to fear, to longing, to the way voices changed when hope was mentioned, even jokingly. He learned who dreamed of escape and who feared it more than chains. He learned who would betray a secret to survive and who would carry one to the grave. Samuel trusted very few. He trusted the land more. The fourth escape began on a night so ordinary it passed without comment. No storm, no moonless sky, just a warm dawn. Ness and a breeze that barely stirred the leaves. That was why it worked. Everyone expected drama. Samuel chose dullness. He did not run immediately. Instead, he waited until the plantation settled into its deepest sleep. When even vigilance grew lazy, he moved slowly, deliberately, taking paths he had walked 100 times before, letting familiarity disguise intent. When he passed the guards, his posture did not change. He looked like a man going nowhere in particular, which was exactly what he needed to be. Once beyond the outer edge of the fields, he turned east, then south, then west again, drawing confusion into the earth itself. He waded into water not to cross it, but to stand still, letting the current pull scent away in all directions. He waited there, submerged to his chest, muscles screaming from stillness, until the night deepened and time loosened its grip. Then he moved. This escape lasted longer than the others. Not because he was faster, but because he was quieter. He avoided roads completely, even when exhaustion begged for smooth ground. He slept in trees when he could, curled tight, blending with bark and shadow. He ate what the land offered without greed. Hunger sharpened him, but he did not let it control him. For the first time, Samuel encountered people who did not know his name. Poor whites scraping by on forgotten land. Free black families who lived cautiously, eyes always scanning the horizon. Some helped him, some turned away, some asked no questions and gave less than they had. Samuel accepted all responses without judgment. Survival was complicated, freedom even more so. He learned something new during that time, something both dangerous and illuminating. He learned that freedom outside the plantation was not clean or simple. It carried its own fears, its own forms of captivity. He saw men bowed by poverty instead of chains, women silenced by threats instead of whips. The world was larger, yes, but cruelty did not end at the fence line. When they caught him this time, it was not through dogs or luck. It was through a man who needed the reward money more than he needed his conscience. Samuel did not fight when the rifle was raised. He did not beg. He looked at the man's hands and saw the shaking. He saw shame hiding behind resolve. That, too, was a lesson. The return was harsher than before. Word had spread. The overseers were angry now, not amused. Anger meant pain. Pain meant warning. They wanted to break something permanent. They failed. They chained him in the yard where everyone could see. They spoke loudly about consequences, about examples. Samuel listened as if the words were weather, unpleasant but temporary. When the whip fell, he focused on breathing. When blood ran, he focused on staying upright. He would not give them the collapse they wanted. What they did not understand was that the fourth escape had already succeeded, not in miles traveled, but in knowledge gained. Samuel had seen the shape O. The world beyond. He had tested himself deeper, longer, harder. He had learned where help might exist and where danger wore a friendly face. He had learned that escape was not an event, but a process. That night, back in his cabin, barely able to move, Samuel stared at the ceiling and felt something unexpected settle inside him. Not despair, not rage, purpose. Clear and unyielding, he would keep escaping, not because he believed he would never be caught again, but because every attempt weakened the lie that this place owned him. Every return sharpened his understanding. Every failure taught him how to succeed later, not just for himself, but for others who watched, who listened, who learned in silence the way he once had. By the fourth escape, Samuel was no longer just running, he was becoming. And the plantation, though it did not yet know it, was no longer strong enough to hold what he was turning into. By the sixth escape, Samuel understood that the plantation no longer believed it could stop him. That realization changed everything. Fear had shifted from punishment to containment, from rage to calculation. They stopped asking why he ran. They stopped mocking him when he returned. Instead, they watched him with a quiet intensity, as if studying a storm that kept changing direction. Samuel noticed the difference immediately. He had learned long ago that when cruelty became careful, it meant something deeper was at risk. They moved him often now, sending him from field to field, from work gang to work gang, hoping motion would disrupt memory and break connections. It did neither. Samuel carried the map of the place inside him. Paths changed, faces changed, but patterns remained. Men with power still grew careless when bored. Men without it still whispered hope into the dark. The land still offered cover to those who knew how to ask. What weighed on Samuel most during this time was not the threat of pain. Pain had become familiar, almost predictable. What troubled him was the responsibility he felt growing heavier with each return. He had become a measure. People measured their courage against his endurance, their fear against his calm. Samuel never wanted to be a symbol. Symbols invited destruction, but he could not erase what others saw when they looked at him. He began to notice the smallest changes among them. The way men stood closer together when guards passed. The way women met his eyes longer than before, searching for something unspoken. The way younger ones asked questions that pretended to be casual, but carried hunger beneath them. Samuel answered carefully. He had learned that words could be as dangerous as chains. The sixth escape came after a long stretch of waiting, longer than any before. Nearly a year passed without an attempt. During that time, Samuel worked harder than ever, his body growing lean and powerful, his movements precise. Overseers praised him publicly, using him as proof that obedience could be learned. Samuel accepted the praise with lowered eyes and a neutral face. Inside, he counted days, watched seasons shift, memorized the sound of insects as summer faded into fall. He waited because he needed to understand something first. He needed to know whether the plantation could be taught to expect his stillness. When the moment came, it was quiet. No argument, no distraction, no companions. This escape belonged to him alone again. He left in the early hours before dawn, when sleep still clung stubbornly to the world. The air was cool, damp with fog that blurred edges and softened sound. Samuel moved through it as if it were water, his body adjusting instinctively, his breath shallow and slow. He did not hurry. He did not hesitate. He trusted the preparation he had built over months of stillness. This time, he did not aim for distance. He aimed for invisibility. Instead of running outward, he folded himself inward, staying close to the plantation's perimeter, hiding in places no one thought to look. He slept beneath abandoned structures, in ditches grown thick with weeds, in shallow hollows that collected mist. During the day, he stayed perfectly still, letting ants crawl over his skin, letting hunger gnaw without complaint. At night he moved only when the fog thickened or the wind rose. It took 2 days before anyone realized he was gone. By then, the usual response had already begun. Dogs, lanterns, shouts echoing into the woods. But something was different this time. The pursuit felt uncertain, unfocused. They searched where he had always gone before, following old expectations instead of fresh thought. Samuel watched them from close enough to hear their voices, his body pressed into earth, his heart steady. He felt something then that surprised him. Not triumph, not relief, a strange, quiet sadness. He saw how fear twisted men into shadows of themselves, how power made them clumsy. He saw how predictable they had become, how tightly they clung to habits, even when those habits failed them again and again. He stayed hidden for days, 5, then 6. He listened to the search weaken, to voices grow tired, to hope drain from their tone. When he finally moved away, it was without urgency, without the burning pressure of pursuit. He traveled farther than before, crossing into places he had never seen, guided by instinct and observation rather than desperation. This escape taught him endurance of a different kind. Solitude pressed in on him, heavy and intimate. There were moments when the silence felt like a weight, when the absence of voices made his thoughts too loud. He remembered laughter from long ago, fragments of songs, faces blurred by time. Loneliness clawed at him more fiercely than hunger ever had. Still, he did not turn back. He encountered danger more subtle this time. Suspicious glances, questions asked too casually. He learned how to answer without answering, how to accept help without staying long enough to invite betrayal. Rust became something he handled sparingly, like fire. For a while it seemed he might not return at all. Days stretched into weeks. The land opened itself to him, offering shelter and small mercies. Samuel felt himself changing, his sense of time loosening, his body adapting to constant movement and stillness in equal measure. He imagined a life lived like this, always careful, always moving, never owned. It was not freedom as he had once imagined it, but it was something close. What brought him back was not capture. It was news. He overheard it by chance, spoken in a low voice by men who did not know who he was. Talk of families separated, of a group punished collectively for one man's attempt to run, of tighter controls, harsher rules, fear spreading outward from his absence. Samuel listened, and something inside him settled into a hard, clear shape. He understood then what his absence meant. He understood the balance he had been walking without naming it. Leaving mattered. But so did returning. When he walked back into the edges of the plantation weeks later, thinner, dirtier, eyes bright with resolve, the shock rippled through the place like a sudden wind. Guards froze. Overseers stared. Dogs barked, confused, uncertain. Samuel did not resist when they approached him. He did not need to. His return spoke louder than any struggle could have. They punished him again, but without the fury of earlier times. This punishment was colder, more deliberate. They wanted to remind him, and everyone else, that control still existed. Samuel endured it as he always had, focusing on breath, on survival, on the knowledge he carried back with him. That night, lying awake and aching, Samuel felt the weight of the sixth escape settle into him fully. He was no longer just proving something to himself. He was shaping something larger, something dangerous and slow-moving. Each escape was a message, not just to those who watched him leave, but to those who watched him come back. The message was simple and terrifying. Chains could fail repeatedly, and the world would not end. Samuel closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of rest. He knew there would be more escapes. He knew the cost would rise. But he also knew this. By leaving and returning again and again, he was stretching the limits of fear until it thinned, until it tore. And once fear tore, nothing built on it could stand for long. By the seventh escape, Samuel had become something the plantation could no longer name. He was no longer just a man who ran, or a problem to be solved with chains and watchful eyes. He had become a presence, felt even when he was still, remembered even when he was gone. His name moved through the cabins without sound, carried in looks and pauses, in breaths held too long. The masters sensed it and hated it, because it was a power they could not catalogue or punish into submission. They tried isolation next, not the obvious kind, but the careful kind meant to starve in. Fluence. Samuel was placed with strangers, men who did not know his history, who looked at him with curiosity rather than hope. He was kept busy, exhausted, worked at tasks meant to leave no room for thought. The overseers congratulated themselves on the strategy. They believed separation would erase memory. They were wrong. Samuel had learned that influence did not depend on familiarity, it depended on example. Men watched how he moved, how he endured, how he returned from punishment without shrinking. They watched the way guards spoke to him differently now, shorter, sharper, as if afraid of saying too much. Fear leaked through authority like water through cracked wood. People noticed. The seventh escape was born out of tension so thick it felt like weather. The plantation breathed uneasily, dogs barked at nothing, guards snapped at one another, overseers drank more than usual. Samuel sensed the instability, the way he sensed rain before it fell. Systems under strain always revealed their fractures. He did not plan the seventh escape around land or timing. He planned it around people. He began speaking more, not loudly, not openly, just enough to let his voice exist again. He asked questions that sounded harmless. He told small truths that felt safe. He listened far more than he spoke. What he learned disturbed him more than any whip ever had. The fear had spread inward. Men were being punished for Samuel's reputation, not his actions. A missing tool was blamed on unrest. A slow workday was blamed on ideas. Whispers of rebellion were invented where none existed, simply to justify cruelty. Innocent people were suffering because Samuel existed as a possibility. He carried that knowledge like a wound. When he decided to escape again, he did so knowing it would change something fundamental. This time, he did not hide his intent as carefully. He allowed a few people to see it in his eyes. He wanted the tension to rise. He wanted the plantation to feel his leaving before he actually went. The night he chose was heavy with heat, the kind that made sleep shallow and tempers thin. The air barely moved. Sweat clung to skin. Samuel waited until just before dawn, when exhaustion dulled even fear. Then he stood and walked away. No stealth, no distraction. He walked openly toward the tree line, his posture calm, his steps unhurried. A guard saw him and shouted. Another froze, unsure whether to act. The hesitation spread like fire through dry grass. Samuel broke into a run only when the first order was finally given. The chase was chaotic. Dogs were released too late. Orders contradicted one another. Men ran without coordination, driven by panic rather than strategy. Samuel led them exactly where he wanted, through broken ground, across water that slowed pursuit, into woods where sound fractured and direction dissolved. But this time, he did not aim to disappear. Instead, he turned, at the edge of a clearing, with pursuit closing fast. Samuel stow. Ped. He stood tall, breathing hard but steady, and waited. When the guards burst through the trees, weapons raised, confusion flickering across their faces, he did not resist. He raised his hands slowly and lowered himself to his knees. The moment stunned them. They had expected flight. They had expected struggle. They had expected fear. What they received was choice. The return was immediate but different. Word spread quickly. Samuel had surrendered. Some claimed it was proof he had finally been broken. Others were unsettled by how calm he had looked, how deliberate his decision had been. The overseers could not agree on what it meant, and disagreement bred anxiety. They punished him, but half-heartedly, uncertain whether severity would create a martyr or leniency would look like weakness. Samuel accepted whatever came without comment. He did not explain. He did not need to, because the seventh escape was never about distance, it was about control. By choosing when to leave and when to return, by turning himself in rather than being taken, Samuel shifted the balance in a way no one could fully articulate. He had demonstrated something far more dangerous than defiance. He had demonstrated autonomy within captivity. That night, as he lay awake, listening to the plantation settle into an uneasy quiet, Samuel felt the weight of what he had done. He had crossed another invisible line. From now on, every rule would feel negotiable, every order provisional. Authority depended on belief, and belief had been shaken. Others felt it too. In the days that followed, small acts of resistance multiplied. Not open rebellion, but hesitation. A slower response. A question asked twice. A task completed imperfectly. Nothing that could be punished alone, but together they formed a pattern. The overseers noticed and grew harsher. Harshness only widened the cracks. Samuel was watched constantly now. Not just by guards, but by everyone. He had become a mirror reflecting possibility, and not everyone liked what they saw. Some feared him. Some resented him. Some clung to him as if he were proof that the world might bend. Samuel carried all of it silently. He understood now that escape was no longer just movement through space. It was movement through minds. Each time he left and returned, he redrew the boundaries of what people believed possible. The seventh escape had redrawn them sharply. He did not sleep much after that. He lay awake, staring into darkness, thinking not of his next escape, but of its consequences. He wondered how many more times the system could absorb this kind of strain before it broke. He wondered how many people would be hurt in the meantime. Most of all, he wondered whether there would come a time when he would leave and not return, not because he was caught or killed, but because staying would no longer serve the purpose he had never intended to take on. By the seventh escape, Samuel knew he was walking a line no one had walked before him, at least not here, not like this. He was no longer just testing the walls of his own cage. He was testing the strength of the cage itself, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars and the patience and the resolve, a quiet certainty began to form. The cage was weakening. By the seventh escape, Samuel had become something the plantation could no longer name. He was no longer just a man who ran, or a problem to be solved with chains and watchful eyes. He had become a presence, felt even when he was still, remembered even when he was gone. His name moved through the cabins without sound, carried in looks and pauses, in breaths held too long. The masters sensed it and hated it, because it was a power they could not catalogue or punish into submission. They tried isolation next, not the obvious kind, but the careful kind meant to starve influence. Samuel was placed with strangers, men who did not know his history, who looked at him with curiosity rather than hope. He was kept busy, exhausted, worked at tasks meant to leave no room for thought. The overseers congratulated themselves on the strategy. They believed separation would erase memory. They were wrong. Samuel had learned that influence did not depend on familiarity. It depended on example. Men watched how he moved, how he endured, how he returned from punishment without shrinking. They watched the way God spoke to him differently now. Shorter, sharper, as if afraid of saying too much. Fear leaked through authority like water through cracked wood. People noticed. The seventh escape was born out of tension so thick it felt like weather. The plantation breathed uneasily. Dogs barked at nothing. Guards snapped at one another. Overseers drank more than usual. Samuel sensed the instability the way he sensed rain before it fell. Systems under strain always revealed their fractures. He did not plan the seventh escape around land or timing. He planned it around people. He began speaking more. Not loudly, not openly. Just enough to let his voice exist again. He asked questions that sounded harmless. He told small truths that felt safe. He listened far more than he spoke. What he learned disturbed him more than any whip ever had. The fear had spread inward. Men were being punished for Samuel's reputation, not his actions. A missing tool was blamed on unrest. A slow workday was blamed on ideas. Whispers of rebellion were invented where none existed, simply to justify cruelty. Innocent people were suffering because Samuel existed as a possibility. He carried that knowledge like a wound. When he decided to escape again, he did so knowing it would change something fundamental. This time, he did not hide his intent as carefully. He allowed a few people to see it in his eyes. He wanted the tension to rise. He wanted the plantation to feel his leaving before he actually went. The night he chose was heavy with heat, the kind that made sleep shallow and tempers thin. The air barely moved. Sweat clung to skin. Samuel waited until just before dawn, when exhaustion dulled even fear. Then he stood and walked away. No stealth, no distraction. He walked openly toward the tree line, his posture calm, his steps unhurried. A guard saw him and shouted. Another froze, unsure whether to act. The hesitation spread like fire through dry grass. Samuel broke into a run only when the first order was finally given. The chase was chaotic. Dogs were released too late. Orders contradicted one another. Men ran without coordination, driven by panic rather than strategy. Samuel led them exactly where he wanted, through broken ground, across water that slowed pursuit, into woods where sound fractured and direction dissolved. But this time he did not aim to disappear. Instead he turned. At the edge of a clearing, with pursuit closing fast, Samuel stopped. He stood tall, breathing hard but steady, and waited. When the guards burst through the trees, weapons raised, confusion flickering across their faces, he did not resist. He raised his hands slowly and lowered himself to his knees. The moment stunned them. They had expected flight. They had expected struggle. They had expected fear. What they received was choice. The return was immediate but different. Word spread quickly. Samuel had surrendered. Some claimed it was proof he had finally been broken. Others were unsettled by how calm he had looked, how deliberate his decision had been. The overseers could not agree on what it meant, and disagreement bred anxiety. They punished him, but half-heartedly, uncertain whether severity would create a martyr or leniency would look like weakness. Samuel accepted whatever came without comment. He did not explain. He did not need to, because the seventh escape was never about distance. It was about control. By choosing when to leave and when to return, by turning himself in rather than being taken, Samuel shifted the balance in a way no one could fully articulate. He had demonstrated something far more dangerous than defiance. He had demonstrated autonomy within captivity. That night, as he lay awake, listening to the plantation settle into an uneasy quiet, Samuel felt the weight of what he had done. He had crossed another invisible line. From now on, every rule would feel negotiable, every order provisional. Authority depended on belief, and belief had been shaken. Others felt it too. In the days that followed, small acts of resistance multiplied. Not open rebellion, but hesitation. A slower response. A question asked twice. A task completed imperfectly. Nothing that could be punished alone, but together they formed a pattern. The overseers noticed and grew harsher. Harshness only widened the cracks. Samuel was watched constantly now, not just by guards, but by everyone. He had become a mirror reflecting possibility, and not everyone liked what they saw. Some feared him, some resented him, some clung to him as if he were proof that the world might bend. Samuel carried all of it silently. He understood now that escape was no longer just movement through space. It was movement through minds. Each time he left and returned, he redrew the boundaries of what people believed possible. The seventh escape had redrawn them sharply. He did not sleep much after that. He lay awake, staring into darkness, thinking not of his next escape, but of its consequences. He wondered how many more times the system could absorb this kind of strain before it broke. He wondered how many people would be hurt in the meantime. Most of all, he wondered whether there would come a time when he would leave and not return, not because he was caught or killed, but because staying would no longer serve the purpose he had never intended to take on. By the seventh escape, Samuel knew he was walking a line no one had walked before him, at least not here, not like this. He was no longer just testing the walls of his own cage. He was testing the strength of the cage itself. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars and the patience and the resolve, a quiet certainty began to form. The cage was weakening. By the eighth escape, the plantation no longer waited for Samuel to run. It waited for him to decide. That waiting hollowed the place out from the inside. Guards watched him with the strained focus of men guarding something already slipping through their fingers. Overseers spoke his name less, as if saying it too often might summon what they feared. Silence gathered around him, thick and uneasy. Samuel felt the change in the way the ground seemed to hold its breath when he passed. He was older now. Not old in years alone, but in experience layered deep into muscle and bone. His body carried the memory of every fall, every blow, every night spent listening for danger. Pain lived in him permanently, a low ache that never fully faded. Yet his movements had grown economical, almost gentle. He no longer wasted energy on anger. Anger burned fast and left nothing useful behind. What sustained him now was clarity. The eighth escape was never meant to look like the others. For weeks beforehand, Samuel did nothing unusual. He did not test boundaries, he did not whisper lessons, he did not provoke fear. He worked, ate, slept, endured. To the overseers it looked like resignation. To the others it looked like mourning. Only Samuel knew the truth. He was preparing to end something, not just for himself, but for the meaning his escapes had taken on. He had begun to understand the cost of returning. Each time he came back, hope rose, and with it, punishment. Not always for him, but for those around him. The system lashed out blindly when it felt threatened. Samuel had seen too many backs scarred, too many families torn apart, blamed not for what they had done, but for what they might imagine. His presence had become a blade that cut both ways. That knowledge weighed on him more heavily than chains ever had. The eighth escape. Be eager at dawn, not night. The sun was just lifting itself above the horizon, turning the mist pale gold. Work had not yet started. The world was caught in that brief moment between command and obedience. Samuel stood, stretched his stiff limbs, and walked, not toward the fields but away from them. People saw him. No one shouted at first. A woman paused with a bucket in her hands. A man straightened slowly, eyes narrowing. Guards hesitated, unsure whether this was another test, another performance, another waiting game. Samuel did not hurry. Precaution. Others watched him, waiting, as they always had, waiting to see what he would do now that escape no longer meant return. Samuel looked at the land one last time, not with hatred, not with longing, but with understanding. He had escaped 13 times, and each time he had come back to teach a lesson no chain could erase. The lesson was never about running away. It was about choosing. When he finally walked forward, it was not as a slave escaping, nor as a symbol returning. It was as a man moving toward a life that belonged entirely to him. And behind him, the plantation did not follow.